Today we come to James chapter 2, verse 14. And if you will, let's just read through to the end of the chapter, verse 26. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works, and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Okay, well today we come to the passage for which in our time at least James is perhaps best known, this famous faith and works passage. And this, as I said in my prayer, has caused many arguments and much confusion. And the reason for that primarily is that it appears that James contradicts Paul. And not just in a general sense, but almost explicitly, in that the words that he uses, the language that he uses here seems to be saying the very opposite of the precise language that Paul uses elsewhere. And so the question usually is posited like this: how is a person saved? Is it by faith alone, or is it by faith plus works? What's the problem with that question?
It's immediately set up a dichotomy.
It's immediately set up a dichotomy? What kind of dichotomy?
Oppositional.
Oppositional? Okay, can you elaborate?
When you phrase it that way, we're immediately saying that there's one of two options here. You're either saved by faith alone, or you're saved by works. And there's not another interpretation or another position or another way to understand it. It's one of these two things. But if you read the last portion here, James doesn't like to engage people in intellectual argument, right? That's not what he's doing. He likes to create imagery and patterns that help you understand the concept. So if we look at one of his last sections here, he says, "For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead." He's not treating these as two separate things. He's treating them as two elements that create a whole, just like we are our spirit and our body.
Okay, good. I like that you mentioned the parts versus the whole, in that this is a concept we've talked about, right? I mean, just last week we talked about the law. Is it just 600 and some odd laws that we have to deal with, or is it one law? Yeah. It's one law. So there is this oneness. So yes, thank you. That's very good. Anybody else?
It sets up a multiple choice of answers A and B. There's no C, all of the above.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No C, all of the above? I thought Nate was going to say something too. No? Okay. So the question I asked was, how is a person saved?
James isn't saying that the works save. He's saying that if you are saved, you will have works.
Okay, good. So you're catching on to Nobody's going to talk to me about my spelling error today?
We thought it was part of the picture. We knew what you
The passing? Is that Pearson. Yeah. How is a person saved? Okay, so the first issue here in the way I addressed or posited the question is this word here. Okay? First of all, what does that word mean?
For salvation.
Okay, but save, this is the verb. Salvation is the abstract noun of the same concept. So what is salvation? Okay. What does that mean?
Being saved from something.
Saved from something. Okay. Yes. So Paul uses this saved language to say you're saved from what? Death, hell, curse, wrath, so on and so forth. So the consequences of the law, or the capital L law, the consequences of the law or law breaking, if you will. Okay? So yes, that's saved. But is this what is this what James is talking about? How is a person saved from death? How is a person saved from hell? How is a person saved from the curse of the law, the wrath of God? Is that what James is talking about here? Is he talking about eternal condition?
I guess I don't see that.
No. I don't see it necessarily either here. Okay, he's not talking about eternal condition salvation. The second thing here, I think, is that when we place James against Paul, this issue of faith and works, Paul also doesn't always use this word saved, and this complicates the matter too. He talks about justified or justification, which is also, we translate as righteousness, okay, for the adjective, the quality of something, a righteous or righteousness. And James uses this language too, so this complicates the matter. So what Paul does is he equates this idea that we talk about saved with being justified. And James, did I misspeak a second ago? This is what Paul does. James, I think, does not necessarily make this kind of connection. Okay? What I argue that for James is similar to the way that justified or justification is used, as we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 4, for example. This is our righteousness. Okay, this obedience of the law. And so for James, what I think justified or being righteous is, justification is, first of all, it is what does being in covenant relationship with God require of me? Okay? What does this covenant require of me as far as my actions go? And so we said covenant, whether it's the old covenant or it's the new covenant, covenant has stipulations. It has requirements that says this is what God will do and how God will behave towards you, and this is what you will do and how you will behave towards God and other people in covenant with God. Okay? For Paul, it's still covenant language, but he often uses this word justify, again, in the sense of saved as that initial point of how does a person get into covenant with God? How does a person start that covenant relationship with God? So do you see the difference? This, for Paul, is how do I begin covenant relationship? For James, it's what does covenant relationship look like when you're in it? Okay, so I don't want to simplify and muddy the terms too much here, but some theologians suggest that what James is using the word justified to refer to is what Paul might use the word sanctified to refer to. Okay? I don't think it's as neat as that, because sanctified is usually this kind of growth in holiness, this refining process of sanctification. For James, it's more of a broad sense of you are a righteous person if you do what the stipulations of the current covenant require of you to do. Not you are justified if you enter into a relationship with God. You are justified if God has adopted you. That's justification. No, that's not what James is doing. He's talking about something that is broader and more general than the specific point at which a person is regenerated, adopted, born again, saved, okay? Those kind of things. So do you see this distinction that I'm making here? Yes? No? It's a little bit of confusion on faces.
As you're talking, the thing I think of is like the thief on the cross.
Uh-huh.
You know, when he puts his faith in Christ,
Uh-huh.
you know, he doesn't have an opportunity for works or anything like that to go on. And it's just
Right.
for salvation for him, it was faith.
So we would put that in terms of what Paul is talking about, this instantaneous kind of moment in time where a person is transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of the Son of His love, Colossians. Okay? For James, it is not that pinpointed moment in time where a person becomes justified. It is moment by moment, day by day, how is your living, how does your living, how do your actions show that you are a righteous person?
Can we say that it's the context of being doers, not just hearers only, and he's basically providing all these for self-examination?
Yeah, we can say that, definitely. But the problem becomes that Paul uses that kind of language too. And we'll look at that in a minute. Okay? So this is the first thing I think we need to understand, that when we talk about righteousness here or justification, we cannot just take Paul's meaning and put it on top of James. Because when we do that, when Paul and James make very similar statements, all of a sudden they're at odds with one another. All of a sudden they're in disagreement and they're fighting. And Paul usually wins because he wrote more Bible. Okay? This is even to the point, it's a famous, the saying that, Martin Luther said that James was an epistle of straw, or in the old-timey language, a right strawy epistle. Okay? He didn't like it because of this reason, and because, for Luther, that turning point for him was Paul. It was, a man is justified by faith alone. The cry of the Reformation, sola scriptura, was followed by what? Sola fide. Okay? And this was in response to the church that said, if you want to get into heaven, you must do these meritorious works. And so Martin Luther was using these scriptures to respond to a very specific situation. I think he was justified in doing so. But even Martin Luther was using this language in a way that was not quite the same as what Paul was using, how Paul was using it, or how James is using it. Okay? I'm not saying, again, he was wrong or he misinterpreted Paul, but I'm saying his interpretation was conditioned or colored very much by the specific circumstance in which he found himself. And because we draw our heritage from him, and other streams that grew out from him, then we tend to side with his interpretation and Paul, whom he relied so heavily on. Whereas the other tradition, the one against which Luther was reacting, the Roman Catholic Church, they tend to take James as support for their argument that it does require works to get into heaven. Okay? And again, the problem with that is, as we've seen here, that's not what James is talking about. So we've got a lot of threads to unravel here. And I'm not going to say that I'm going to be able to unravel all of them and identify all of them and then put it back together again nicely. My hope is that in addressing this, at least we can alleviate some of the concern, but that's even my secondary concern. My primary concern is not, let's put it this way, not that let's try to settle the differences between James and Paul, but what is James saying and what is our response to it?
I think a key to that, though, is also who's he saying it to.
Right.
That makes it a whole lot easier to break those threads apart.
Okay, so who is he saying this to?
He was considered to be one of the largest teachers and leaders in Jerusalem.
Yeah, he was a pastor
as opposed to an evangelical like Paul, who was reaching out to a lot of people who had not heard the gospel. And that, when you're talking to different groups, you're going to say different things.
Right.
And it just makes it a whole lot easier to break down if you think of it that way.
Right. So, in the most simple terms, right, I mean, Paul was addressing Gentiles.
Paul was talking to unconverted Gentiles.
Yeah.
James was talking to the congregation.
To Jews.
Literally.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so, yes, we do need to keep that in mind, that affects, because the Jews to whom he was preaching or writing here were people who already were in covenant with God, right? And Paul was talking to Gentiles who maybe were God-fearers, maybe were not. They were not in covenant with God. And he makes that explicit in places like Ephesians chapter 3, or chapter 2, second half of chapter 2, that they're alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. So now what? How do they get from that condition, no hope, no covenant, no God, to hope, covenant, God, future, glory? Okay, that's Paul's concern. Okay, James's concern is, okay, now how is that? How do you live? You who are in covenant, you who have the covenants, you who have hope, you who have God, how do you live? Okay. So the question. What good is it, my brothers, if someone has faith but does not have works? What's the answer to that question? No good. If we're thinking in Pauline terms, we're saying, it's wonderful. I have faith and I don't have works and now I get to be saved, right? For James, the answer is, it's useless. It's useless. Okay? So now I'm talking to you not as, if you are not a believer, if you are not converted, if you do not know Jesus Christ, if you have not been adopted by God, then I will tell you, set your works aside, fix your eyes on Jesus, exercise faith in Him and what He has accomplished on your behalf, throw away every other hope of salvation, of being delivered from the wrath of God and eternal punishment, and throw yourself on the mercies of God. Trust Him. Put your trust in His word that He will do for you. He will save you as He said He would do. That's what I would say to you. But I trust that everyone in here is in covenant with God already. And so I would tell you, if you tell me you have faith and you're not doing anything about it, your faith is useless. It's worthless. Now, the question is, why is that? Okay. He gives an example. He says, can that faith save him? Oh, there's that save language, right? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the needs for the body, what good is that? What good is that? What's the answer to the question? Huh? Nothing. James is not alone in saying this. Look at 1 John chapter 3. And someone read verses 16 through 18.
We know love by this, that He laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or tongue, but in deed and truth.
Okay. So a few parallels there to James. The first one is the one we just read, and we see it in verse 17 here. If you have the world's goods, if you have food and clothing and shelter, and you see a brother who does not have those things, and you say, not my worry, not my business, someone else will take care of it, that's a problem. In the same way, James says, if you see someone who has a need and you say, oh, Nate, I'm going to pray for you, and then you go away, that's a problem. James says, if that's the case, if that's a typical scenario in your life, your faith is worthless. John says, if that's a typical scenario in your life, then God's love is not in you. Your faith and your love are bogus. Both of them. What is required in situations like that? If God's love really lives in you, you're going to love your neighbor. And you're going to take of the goods that you have and provide for the need of your brother. In the same way, James is saying, if your faith is genuine, you're not just going to say, the Lord bless you. You're going to say, the Lord bless you. Now let me give you this. Your faith is going to be followed with action. Another parallel is verse 18 here in 1 John 3:18. Let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. Not just word and talk, but action. Did we just see that in James? Last week before, or verse 12, so last week, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. James is, don't be hearers only, but doers as well. So action and faith. Not just talk, but doing. John and James are on the same page here, and they are in full agreement. So, he says also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Faith in God always produces a result. Always produces an action. Okay? And I want to talk about how that is in a minute, but I want to get through the rest of his examples here and talk about some of these disagreements. Okay? Verse 18, he says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my works by my faith. So, first of all, let's just address this. It sounds weird. If he's addressing people that say, we have works, or we have faith, we don't need works, then it sounds backwards for him to say, you have faith, I have works. Okay? That's not what they're saying. James, you have faith, we have works. The people that James is addressing are saying, we have faith, we don't need works. Okay? So I think what this might be is a situation where there's someone in the congregation saying, don't worry about works, you have faith. To the people to whom James is writing. Does that make sense? It's similar to what Paul does in some of his letters, and he kind of quotes the people who are preaching to the churches. Okay? So James is saying here, I think, someone is there among you saying, you have faith, I have works, together we'll just balance it out. It's okay. And James says, baloney. Show me your faith without works. This guy says it's okay for you to have faith without works. You show me what that faith is. Show me. Prove it to me. I dare you. What kind of faith is that? He says, and the implication is you can't. You cannot show me your faith if you have no works. In fact, I will show you my faith by my works. My actions will prove the genuineness of my faith. Verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. What is that statement? You believe that God is one, you do well. What is that statement? Where does that come from? It's the Shema, right? And we saw this last week, this you do well. Look at verse 8 again. If you are really fulfilling the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. You believe that God is one. You are doing well. So two times in this book that James says this, you're doing well, or you do well, and they're both attached to the great commandment and the one that is like unto it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and your soul, and might. Love your neighbor as yourself. Even the demons believe that and shudder. The point here is that faith is not merely assent to facts. You say, we believe truth about who God is. We have our doctrine of the Godhood down pat. We have theology proper, Christology, pneumatology, Trinitology, all of that stuff figured out. We've got systematic theologies read, marked, underlined, memorized, and we can discourse and debate on the finer aspects of theology all day long. I am solid doctrinally. Great. So is Satan. And what is their response? This is not, there's more to this, and hopefully it'll hit a little bit harder when you see it. Demons have right doctrine. What's their response? They shudder. Even the demons' faith is followed by action. And that's an appropriate action for demons, isn't it? Isn't it? They shudder before the presence of God at the thought of proper understanding of who God is. And if demons' faith is accompanied by a kind of works that corresponds with what that faith requires and yours doesn't, there's something wrong. You don't really have faith. They shudder very much because they understand exactly what this means, that God is one. Think of when Jesus walks in, one of the very first instances in the Gospels. It's a beautiful thing in Mark, for example. So what's the central, let me back up, the central confession in the book of Matthew? Right in the middle of the book, and it's the central confession geographically, if you will, and it's also the highlight, one of the most important confession. Comes out of the lips of the prophet or the apostle with a foot-shaped mouth. I hear him called. What's the central confession? Yeah. Who do you say that I am? Oh, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed art thou, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Right? Who was the first one to make that confession in the gospel? Yeah.
Cast them all into swine?
Huh?
Is it when you cast them into swine?
Nope, that was later. Look at Mark. That's the easiest one to find because it's right at the beginning. Look at Mark, verse 21 of chapter 1. He says, "And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.'" You see faith in action there? I mean, he's not just saying, rather stoically, "Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are." I mean, I envision this guy like frothing and trembling before him, frightened because he knows who Jesus is And Jesus rebukes him, and he says, "Shut up." That's what "be silent" means, by the way. Shut up and get out of him. See, this is not the saving kind of faith. This is not the proper kind of faith. This is not a believing, submissive kind of faith, but it is still a kind of faith. It's the kind of faith that these people are claiming to have, that they have right apprehension of who God is. They believe the right things. And James says, so do demons. And here's an example of a demon who believes the right thing, and his response is fear and trembling before Jesus. And the question is, so what? So what if you have that kind of faith? Yea, you. You just put yourself on par with the demons. Are you proud of that? Are you proud of that? He says, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham, he gives two examples here, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. I think that becomes a key phrase. Faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now here's the problem. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. That sentence there is almost exactly opposed to what Paul says in Romans. So turn over to Romans. Okay, look at chapter 3. In verse 20, he says, for by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So no one will be justified through works of the law. Now look down to verse 28. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. We hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. James, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And they're saying exactly the opposite thing. Right? Wrong.
Two different covenants.
Not two different covenants, I would say, but two different aspects of the covenant.
Is Paul not referring to the old covenant when he said works of the law?
Yes and no.
Okay.
He's saying
Law, when he says law, is he talking thorough law in the Old Testament?
he's talking about Torah.
Law of sin, okay.
Yeah, but I think James is talking about Torah as well.
Okay.
That we covered a few weeks ago. That Torah still applies to us today, in the sense that the stipulations of the New Covenant aren't entirely different from the Old Covenant. I mean, there are some that don't transfer. Specifically the ones that have to do with cult and sacrifice, of course. But plenty of them do. But what James is talking about, or what Paul is here talking about, it's from the context. You have a situation where everyone is unrighteous, everyone has violated the law, everyone stands condemned under the law, everyone is in a position where, having broken the law, they are culpable for those actions, and they are subject to condemnation, which is death. Now, how does a person get out of this situation of guilty and condemned? It cannot happen by more law doing, by obeying law. It cannot happen by works of law, because you already stand condemned. The only way that it can happen is if a propitiation is made. And that propitiation, God gave Son. It's the whole context of this section of chapter 3 of Romans. Okay? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith, so on and so forth, to show God's righteousness. So then we cannot boast about what we have received, because person is justified by faith, by believing and receiving from God what He has offered in Jesus Christ. For James, it is, you say you believe certain truths about God, and those truths that you believe about God never move you to action, then those beliefs are contradicted by your actions. As a matter of fact, if you look, there's some agreement here when we talk about this old covenant. Paul uses the same kind of language that James uses earlier in chapter 2. He says in verse 12, "For all also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. It is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified." Does that sound like James? Very much sounds like James. It is James. It is James. And this poses another problem. Because is Paul affirming believers now? No. He's saying that's for the old covenant. That's the old covenant. That the person who is justified by the law is the one who does the law perfectly. And what's the problem with that? No one does the law. And therefore none are justified. Instead, all are condemned by the law. And that's where Paul's faith without works comes in. You have to get out of that condition first. You have to be saved. You have to be redeemed. You have to be justified in that sense. Go ahead.
Well, is James talking about the judgment where the verse that talks about the man walking through the fire and everything that he had with him was burned, but he was okay?
That's Paul.
He's talking. Oh.
Yeah, Paul. He's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was meaning like that type of judgment versus the.
Sure. I think James talks about just judgment in general. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, that God is the judge. And judgment will happen whether it's now or later, this life or the next. That we deal with the God who is a judge. That's part of His character, and who He is and what He does. All right, so for Paul, he does use James's language. And again, they're using the same language because they're using the same textbook. Okay, they're both referring to the Old Covenant. They're both referring to the old, what we call the Old Testament, the books of the law. Okay, but again, Paul's dealing with a different kind of issue. It is, how do you get out of this broken, condemned situation or position into a position of sonship and acceptance before God? It's not by law doing, because you've already broken the law. You've already lost that any possibility of being declared righteous by law doing. Okay. James is saying, now you are in right relationship with God. Now you have to still obey. Your actions still have to justify the reality of your faith. And he's still talking in terms of law. I mean, that brings us to a whole lot of other questions that we don't have time to address today. But for example, does the law still apply to Christians? Yes. But that causes problems if you say yes. No. Oh, that causes a lot of problems too. Maybe. Okay. Yes and no. Yes, it does, and no, it doesn't. Yes, it does, because God is God and He doesn't change. No, it doesn't, because that law has become obsolete, at least parts of it, because it's been superseded. Like we said, those cultic aspects, the sacrificial aspects, that all of the blood and the slaughter has been replaced by one high priest. The priesthood has been replaced. That's what all Hebrews is about. But the commandments, the central commandments, remain. The commandments to love God, to love your neighbor, those remain and govern everything. And that's the point at which both Paul and James finally land in agreement on the same ground. Because Paul will say all the law is fulfilled in this one word, to love your neighbor as yourself. And we've already seen James say that's the royal law. That's the law that epitomizes all the law. And here he's throwing out the Shema. This is the law that epitomizes all the law. So I don't think he's in disagreement. He's in agreement, but he's addressing they're addressing two very different situations. And what Paul will say, just like John has said, is the same as what James has said. That neither, and for example, Galatians, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision count for anything, which is law-keeping, by the way, in the way that Paul uses it, but faith working through love. Faith works through love. So the issue here is there such a thing as faith that never results in changed behavior? No. It is inconceivable that you could ever have a faith that does not affect your behavior. And he gives these examples of Abraham. Paul uses Abraham believed God and was counted to him as righteousness, Genesis 15:6, to support his view that a man is justified by faith, Galatians 3, Romans 4. James uses it to support his position that a person is justified by works, because Genesis 15:6 ended several chapters later with Isaac laying on an altar. Okay? Now, how is that? How does that action justify his faith? And let me show you, I think, what's happening here. Is faith a one-time thing? What is faith? Clearly, it's not just assent to doctrinal truth. We've seen that, right? At least not the kind of faith we need to have. Because we want to have a faith that's not just equivalent to what demons have.
You can almost say it's a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle. How have we defined faith?
Believing that God can and will do what He said He will do.
Taking God at His word. He means what He says. He'll do what He says. He can and He will. Okay? That's why Abraham was, when he believed God, it was counted him as righteousness. God made Abraham a promise. Abraham believed Him, even though he was very old. God would do this thing. And He could do this thing. What was that promise?
That you have descendants.
From your very own body, not from your house. It's not, your descendant isn't going to be your house servant, okay? And later on, over the course of the chapters, it's not even going to be that descendant from Hagar. Sarah will have a child. And you'll call his name Isaac. Later on, Isaac's born, yea, wonderful fulfillment of the promise, at least the beginning of it, one son. But part of that promise back in Genesis 15 isn't just you'll have one son, it's what? You'll have descendants more than you can count. Okay, so here's the fulfillment of the promise. God said, you will have a son, you'll call him Isaac, he will be the means through which you become the father of an uncountable multitude. Now, what does God's command later on, I can't remember the chapter, was it 20? Something like that? To sacrifice Isaac do? What does that do? It tests him. Why?
Because he can say it all he wants to, but action.
Right. Does he really believe? Oh yeah, Isaac's the promised one. God promised me Isaac, and it's through Isaac I'll have a multitude of descendants. Okay, Abraham, do me a favor. Kill your son. But you said that Isaac is the, yep, that's what I said, that's what I promised, sacrifice him. But I don't understand, how can he be the means through which I become the father of multitudes? And yes, that's exactly what I said, yes. Okay, but if I sacrifice him, don't worry about that, sacrifice him. If Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac at that point, if he doesn't follow through with what God has told him to do, does he believe, really, that Isaac is the one that God is going to use to make him the father of the many nations? No. His actions at that point prove that he doesn't really believe that this is what God is going to do. But if he does follow through in obedience, even though it makes no sense to him to sacrifice his child or how God can make this happen, God has promised, and so it's up to God. His actions are conditioned and motivated by his faith in God. In the same way, and I know I'm out of time here, in the same way, he says, Rahab, gives this example, was justified not by simply saying, hey, guys, your God is the right God. It was by saying, look, I know your God has allowed you to just annihilate every other city in this place, and your God is going to annihilate Jericho. Wonderful. Go back and take a nap, right? No, she believed that. She was firmly convinced of that, and so she acted, right? She gave them quarter. She gave them information. She let them out a secret way, and she was saved. Faith always results in actions. What you believe, and this is just a basic fact of human existence, right? What you believe always affects how you behave. Have you found that to be true in your own life? We talk about this in our household quite a bit, just working through our own struggles in our marriage, that there are lies that we tell ourselves that affect how we relate to each other. Those are deeply seated beliefs that affect how I behave and how I relate to my wife. The same is true for faith. Yes, I believe that God is one. How does that affect your living? Okay, let's just forget Paul for a moment. Let's forget about how James and Paul relate to one another, and let's just be honest with what James is saying. If you say, yes, I love my neighbor as myself, and you see your neighbor has a need, and you just say, I'm praying for you, you don't love him. You don't love your neighbor. If you say, I love God with all of my heart and soul and might, and yet you don't pray, you don't spend time in His Word, I'm sorry, but you don't. Your faith is faulty. James is very much talking to people like you and me who are believers, who would say, yes, I'm in relationship with God. And like we've seen so many times, we say we end up as people who are satisfied simply being hearers. We read the Word, we come to Sunday school, we go to church, and yet we're comfortable with things like partiality. It's not my responsibility to take care of my brother who's going to be by himself on Thanksgiving. Where's your faith? Don't make this about just simply having another right doctrinal position. If I'm honest, I think this whole 500-year argument between James and Paul, imagined argument, is a conspiracy of Satan to keep people off the main point here. Don't make this about being another point at which you can be right doctrinally. If you figure this out and have this just perfectly clear in your mind, and you aren't willing to open your wallet to somebody who is in need, then your faith, your doctrinal correctness is worthless. So let's be people who aren't just hearers. Let's be doers. Let's so speak and so act as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace.